Well, hello again, my friends. This is Paul Elson, sometimes known as the Farmer, and today is session 3 of weird and mysterious things that were going on in the Hebrew temple after Jesus' crucifixion. Messages from God, in a sense. In this session, we'll continue that discussion, talking about the temple doors and how they were decorated, and the veil and how it was decorated. The Jewish temple was divided into basically 3 areas. You had the outer court, the large outer court, which is called the court of the Gentiles. Then you had a wall called the Soreg wall, or the middle wall of partition. And then you had the Soreg gate. Through that gate you went into the women's court. Now the women's court was Jews only. Only Jews, men or women, could go into that area. And then from the women's court into the holy place, you had the large wooden doors. We'll get into those here in a little bit. And then between the holy place and the Holy of Holies, you had the veil, which you've all heard about. And you're going to be surprised at some things I'm going to bring up for you regarding that. Now, within the holy place, that's where the sacrifice was made, the blood was collected, there was furniture in there, the blood sacrifice for the altar, the menorah, the candles burning, oil lamps, whatever was necessary for the Levitical priesthood to do their jobs. That's where several priests were working throughout the day and evening doing their various jobs. And then from the holy place into the Holy of Holies was where the veil was, the large veil. And I'm going to give you some details about that you may not have known. Now let's get to the doors first. The doors were very large wooden doorways made of cedar, and then in some descriptions they're covered in bright polished copper. So they're beautiful doors with a lot of decorations on them. They were gorgeous, official looking doors, very large. And then you had the veil, and the veil weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 pounds, and it took several hundred priests to put it in place. Now, why were we told that it was torn from top to bottom? We know that it was torn in two and split, in other words, but there's a reason why we're told it was torn from top to bottom. Okay? Now, no person could tear that veil. It was just too big, too thick, and too heavy, which is why we refer to it as a miracle. So the inner veil of partition, the one between the holy place and the Holy of Holies, there were actually 2 curtains, 2 veils. So think of 2 parallel veils running there from one side of the temple to the other. Now these 2 parallel curtains were about 40 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and there was about 18 to 20 inch space between them. In other words, enough for the priest to walk between them. So they formed a narrow corridor running from north to south. Each curtain was about 4 inches thick and highly decorated with cherubim, gold threads, beautiful blue and scarlet colors. The fabric of the veil was a hand breadth thick, so the veil was each about that thick. Okay, woven of 72 strands. Each strand consisted of 24 threads. The veil was, as I said, 20 cubits wide, 40 cubits tall, and each veil was made by 82 young seamstresses or young women. They made 2 veils each year. And then when they went to clean the veil before putting it up, it took about 300 priests to clean it. Now that says in the Jewish book, the Talmud, which I'll refer to several times, you can see there in Jewish books, it says it took 300 priests to immerse it. Now they would wash it, but they wouldn't necessarily wash it with soap and water. They would cleanse it once it was done and collected dust to clean it. The outer curtain extended from the south to the north wall, but before it got to the north wall, it left a small access point. It stopped just short of the wall. Okay, the inner one went the opposite direction, from the north to the south wall, and it left at its end also a small opening to walk into. So on Yom Kippur, the high priest would go enter the one end of the veil, then walk down that corridor between the two veils, there, where the other opening was, and then turn into the Holy of Holies. The Ryrie Study Bible says in Exodus 26 that Josephus reported that it took, the veil was 4 inches thick, and that it was renewed every year, and that it took a horse or several horses tied together, and they could not even pull the curtain apart. It was that big, that thick, and that strong. Now, the large wooden doors, each wooden door, there were two of the doors, made of cedar, and they were clad in gold and copper gilding, and then had many other decorations on them to give them great beauty. Okay, the priests, when they went into the holy place, they had to be clothed in priestly garments that had no tears, stains, or flaws that took away from the beauty of the garment. Then the priests could go in and do their job. It was demanded that the priestly garments reflect the role of their service to God. So these garments had to be gorgeous, representing their position in working for God. The Holy of Holies had this one veil covering its entrance, okay? On Yom Kippur was when the one day when the high priest or the holy priest could go in there. Now, access to the temple area was limited to within the holy place and the Holy of Holies to Levitical priesthood, and they were assigned jobs. Every morning, very early, they would get up before sunrise, and they would be assigned on a rotating basis different jobs that they had to do in the temple, that area, or that in that time period or that day, and the jobs were rotated. Okay, remember our name for the high priest is high priest, but the Jewish name, his name is Kohen Gadol. That's the official name, meaning the supreme religious being, the highest religious human being. All the doorways had gates. So on the sides of the temple, you would have like the sacrifice gate. That's where people would bring in the sacrifices, or the wood gate for burning at the altar, burning the sacrifice. That's where the wood would be brought in. So along the sides, you would have functional gates. But in the middle, the gates from place to place would have purpose. They'd have a serious religious name and purpose. So when you go from the women's court to the holy place to the Holy of Holies, you had those three entrances, gates if you want to call them that. Now, what were their names? Their names were the way, the truth, and the life. Now, if you know your New Testament, how does Jesus describe himself? He says he is the way, the truth, and the life. Now, he's explaining to Jewish listeners, so they would have referenced the temple. They would have known that he was comparing himself to the doorways, the entrances within the temple. So for them to get to God, or any human being to get to God, they had to go through the way, the truth, and the life, the various doorways, in other words. And those barriers would keep people from getting there. So Jesus was now saying that those barriers were removed, that he is now the way to God. He is now the way, the truth, and the life. So it's kind of an interesting little tidbit there that you may not have realized. Now, what I'm going to tell you is written records written by scribes and rabbis and historians of strange events that occurred. This isn't prophecy or my opinion. These are eyewitness written accounts. So if you look over onto the right corner there, from Yom 39b, which is a Jewish writing, it says, "The doors of the sanctuary opened by themselves as a sign that they would soon be opened by enemies." Now, I'll refer to this a little bit later, but I want you to point out that that's from Jewish writings, what history shows. Now, the actual date of Jesus' crucifixion is not absolutely known. Some people think he's around 29 to 30 AD, some as late as 33 AD. We do not have an exact written date. We have good guesses, but that's about it. We also know that Jesus prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple when he was still alive, and we also know that his ministry lasted about 3 years. Now Jesus stated in Matthew, the quoted him saying, I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. This was his description, his prophecy about the temple and Jerusalem being destroyed. Now, during this time period, the Romans and historians kept some decent records, some pretty good records. Okay, so Josephus being one of the most studied of the writers and historians of that time. Now, most scholars, historians, and Bible students agree that the Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed in the spring of AD 70, spring to summer, that transition time period. We also know about the veil being torn from top to bottom. It was a barrier between God and people. We also know that was removed. Okay, but there were other barriers also. We need to see if they were and how they were removed. For example, the massive wooden doors between the women's court and the holy place. Were those doors removed? The Bible doesn't tell us. Okay, that's one of the mysteries. Let's back up a little bit. In Ezekiel chapter 8 and chapter 10, he describes his vision of things that were going on in the temple, abominations within the Jerusalem temple. And they indicated a severe decline in the faithfulness of the Israelites, their faithfulness to God, and that there were some abominations and idol worship going on within the temple. So in his vision, he talks about the worship of idols, carved idols into the temple wall, the worship of the sun god Tammuz, and all the other things going on. But he talks specifically about four things. That the idol walls, he says, images of idols, including every form of creeping things and beasts and detestable things, were carved into the temple walls. He also goes on saying that there were pictures showing women shown weeping for Tammuz, who was a Mesopotamian god associated with fertility and death, demonstrating another idea of the foreign religious practices that were happening in the temple. Another picture drawn shows 25 men seen bowing down to the sun, demonstrating that they were in blatant disregard and rejection of God and his temple. He also talks about violence, contempt for God, and he highlighted the phrase, they put a branch to their nose. If you research that, that is a highly non-complimentary term of disrespect showing between God, the Jewish people, and God. Okay, so that's what he saw in his vision was going to be happening in the second temple. Now, I've added a few things to our conversation you may not have been aware of. So let's review this barrier concept. The first barrier was the doorway between the court of the Gentiles and the women's court. The next barrier was the huge wooden doors between the women's court and the holy place. The third barrier was the veil blocking the door of the Holy of Holies. The fourth barrier was a person, the human high priest, the Jewish high priest. He prevented anyone from going into the Holy of Holies but himself. Then the fifth barrier was the blood sacrifice that was required to be brought into the temple. Now, was God's presence in the Holy of Holies? I argue it was not. For us to access God's presence, we would have had to pass through these various doorways, the court of the Gentiles, women's court, wooden doors into the holy place, and then lastly the high priest blocking and the veil into the Holy of Holies. We all know some of these veils were removed. We know the human high priest was removed and replaced by our King, Jesus Christ, as our new high priest. Okay, we also know the blood sacrifice was taken care of by Jesus Christ when we drew his blood at the crucifixion. Okay, so that was taken care of. So we know 3 barriers were taken care of. Now, of the 5 barriers, what was left? The wooden doors, were they removed? The Bible doesn't tell us. So let's see what's going on here. One of the strange things occurring in the temple was this. The wooden interior doors, remember, they were huge. It took 100 priests, took 30 priests to open and close them. It took hundreds of priests to put them in place. They were locked, closed and locked every night. This is recorded in several places of the priestly duties. So every night they would verify the doors being locked. Yet in the morning, when the priests arrived for their duties, they found the doors opened. So a normal first assumption you and I might make would be someone forgot to close and lock the doors. That makes sense. That evening, the Levitical staff would again close and lock the doors. The next morning, they would find the doors open again for no apparent reason, or having any evidence that someone was tampering with the doors. So this went on for several years up until AD 70. The doors, and then just before, in the last maybe 10 to 15 years, before AD 70, it's recorded in Tractate Yom 39 that the doors started to open by themselves late in the afternoon on several days. So according to rabbinical records, this went on for many years. The priests knew. Now there was another Old Testament prophecy from Zechariah about the temple, Zechariah 11. And it says, "Open your doors, Lebanon, so that fire may devour your cedars. Wail, you junipers, for the cedar has fallen, the stately trees are ruined." Now when you look at the term Lebanon there, Lebanon, the word actually means whiteness, white, bright white. It's not talking about the country or the people. Okay, so this is how they described their temple. It was a white building, made of the highest quality, whitest, shiniest limestone and quartz blocks they could find to build the temple. So that's why it had this reputation. It was called the White House of the Lord. The temple was going to be destroyed. They had prophecies about that, which in fact did happen. Now, many priests interpreted the opening of the doors by themselves as a sign that soon an enemy would come in and open the doors. Excuse me. But then a senior rabbi stepped in. The doors had become such an issue that the priest decided he needed to do a type of incantation, or if you want, an exorcism. He scolded the doors and the spirit that was causing the phenomena. But he did not know he was unknowingly speaking against God, because God was causing the phenomena of the doors to open. God was removing the barrier of the doors, and the Jews kept closing it. Okay? So this rabbi's name was Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai, and he spoke to the sanctuary, and he said, "Sanctuary, sanctuary, why do you frighten yourself with these signs? I know that you will be ultimately destroyed." He was referring to Zechariah's prophecy there. But he did not realize that Jesus had also prophesied the destruction of the temple. Now, if he did realize it, he ignored it. Because if you remember, the Jews refused to acknowledge Jesus as Messiah. Therefore, they ignored officially things that he said. The priests recorded the strange opening of the doors between the years of about AD 30 and AD 70, so about 40 years. Okay, remember AD 70 is when the Romans came in and destroyed the area. In fact, they cleaned off that area so thoroughly that when the Muslims came in much later, they found a perfect place to build their mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, on an area that was just perfectly placed for them. The records show these strange openings of the doors went on for 40 years. Now, nowhere in Jewish records does it acknowledge Jesus' prophecy about the future destruction. But the mysteries didn't stop. In fact, even more strange things kept happening. But let's finish this session before we go there. Now remember, today, the Temple Mount, as it's called, is in the old city of Jerusalem. It has two big structures on it, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Okay, those are two structures that are revered by the Muslims. You cannot go into this area. It's a restricted area, and you cannot go in without special permission from the managers who watch over the area. Non-Muslims who go in are not allowed to enter and pray, open or silent prayer. You cannot read the Bible or the Torah while you're walking around the area. There are also clothing restrictions. You have to be dressed modestly, and there are staff there who watch the visitors to make sure they follow the rules. So I'm setting you up for a future thought here. Now let's go back to the veil for a second. The veil was to show God's robe of righteousness. It was God's outer clothing of his inside presence. Okay, now I'll explain that here in a little bit. Go back to I'm just setting you up with that thought. Let's go back to the Dome of the Rock. Okay, in recent months, Jewish rabbis and a few other religious leaders have seen a big change. The WAQF, the ones who control the Temple Mount area and allow people to go in or not who are not Muslims, started to loosen the reins a little bit. Now you're seeing God in action today. You're seeing the prophecy opening up today, okay? Now the Israeli police are given tasks to enforce the restrictions of the visitors. And the reason is they don't want to have any political or religious antagonism occurring that could cause riots or an unstable truce. But as of the fall of 2024, around October, things started to change. God is opening up doors. A few Jewish rabbis and some of their staff were allowed to enter the Temple Mount area and actually pray and read their Bibles or Torah. Some were even allowed to prostrate themselves on the ground in praying positions. You are now seeing prophecy in slow motion this very day. The gates of the denial to the Temple Mount are opening, ever so slightly, to non-Muslim religious leaders. You today are seeing an actual prophecy happening right before your eyes. I hope you realize how big a deal this is. You're seeing God's hand moving and shaking and changing the world around Jerusalem. Okay, let's go back to the veil now. We know it was torn from top to bottom. Why wasn't the whole veil just torn down, fall down? Why wasn't it just ripped and left in place? Okay. Now let me tell you a Bible hint. It's not a trick to fool you, but it's a way God gives us of alerting readers to understand there is more to what is being written down than what appears is just the words. So the information about the tearing of the veil is one of those hidden messages. The book of Matthew is one of the books that speaks about the veil, as do others. And it says, at that moment, when Christ died, in other words, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When God tells you specifics like that, there's a reason. We've all read that many times. It's a common explanation that the veil was a barrier between people and God. Now that Jesus had completed his sacrifice, the barrier was removed, so the doorway was now open for believers to come to God more directly. We now have access to God, our Abba Father, and do not have to go through a human high priest. Jesus is now our permanent high priest. Okay, I agree with that reasoning, but there's more to it that is not taught about the veil. Why didn't Matthew just say, torn from top to bottom, boom, done with it? Since the doors open in the temple are made of special wood and covered with gold and copper embellishments, why not do the same with the door into the Holy of Holies? Just make the Holy of Holies a wooden door instead of the veil, okay? Make it an even nicer door, a wooden door. No, God did not want to do that. He wanted a veil there, specifically a veil, and he told Moses specifically how the barrier was, it's called a parashet, how it was to be made. In Exodus 26, it talks about how the veil, the entrance barrier, was to be made to show God's majesty in material, in colors and decorations that were woven into it. This could not be done with a wooden door. A wooden door would not express God's garments. Why was it torn from top to bottom, not bottom to top? Because it was God who did it. If people did it, they would have torn it from the bottom up. Our majestic God from on high tore it from on high to low, from the royal top to the lowly bottom. It now opened up heaven on high to earth down below. When God's word describes some small detail, most people just pass over it, but the details are put there for a reason. A couple other things to know. If a word is in italics when you're reading it, that normally means that it was not in the original manuscripts, that it was added at some point by a scribe or translator thinking that that sentence may need some clarification. When you read details about something, stop and ask yourself, why is the detail put there? Then do some research, because it will open up even more understanding and depth to what you're reading. Will it slow the process down? Yeah, it will. But what you gain is worth it. Why torn instead of simply being removed of the veil? The removal would have accomplished the same thing. Okay, the doorway being open to God. Well, that's another mystery, and the answer lies in the history of the Jewish culture. Ripping and tearing of an outer garment was cultural to the Jews. It meant a couple of things. In the Bible, when a son or family member was killed or some other terrible event happened in a household, the male head of the household would, in anger and anguish and pain, tear his outer clothing. He had his outer clothing, he would tear it open. Okay? There are many stories where this occurred, of the causing of the tearing of the outer garment at King David, Joshua, Job, and others. The garment being torn was a representation of status. The outer garment was a representation of status and protection for the person wearing it. Okay? It was also a sign of authority. The outer cloak visibly expressed things about the person who wore it. The temple outer garment represented the inner presence of God, the Father, in the Holy of Holies, where he represented or presented his presence to the people. It was where his symbolic presence dwelt here on earth. The veil garment was the outer garment of his presence, so to speak. I hope you get that. The Father of Jesus, to the Father of Jesus, the tearing of the veil represented two things. It expressed God's anguish and pain of his Son being sent to his death by the very people God loved, and making the pain even more hurtful. And as God had said, he required a blood sacrifice, the death of his Son, and then removed the barrier between God and man that had been put up from the time of Adam's sin. So I believe the renting of the veil represented both the historical and cultural approach to personal pain and the opening of the doorway between God and his people. So now another barrier had been removed by God for the benefit of his people. Had God simply removed the veil, it would have symbolized only one thing, the removal of the barrier between him and mankind. But it would not have shown his pain and his anguish and his hurt at what happened to his one and only Son, and how the Jewish culture expressed such pain at the time. Your God, my God, is a personal God. He wants you to share your thoughts and dreams with him just as much as he wants you to know his thoughts and wishes for his family. Okay, so you see, I was getting at earlier when I said look at the details, and when you see them, ask why they're there. 90% of the time, I think you will find wonderfully interesting factoids about God, Jesus, the apostles, the Bible, and maybe you'll even learn something about yourself by knowing his word. In keeping with my time trying to stay around 30 minutes, I think we went over a little bit with this one. So we're going to end this session, okay? But the next video, we're going to talk about even more weird things that were occurring in the temple. You will see God's sign language to all of us in each of these strange events that were happening in the temple for almost 40 years. I want you to know that God loves you. I love you, and as a fellow Christian, I wish you and your family God's many blessings. May the Lord bless and keep you. Thank you for your prayers, by the way, and support. I am your friend, the farmer.